Hello everyone, welcome to my video on resistance and damage reduction math. Now this video is building off heavily on my attack math video, so if you haven't seen that I highly recommend you watch that first since it's going to be pretty crucial to understanding this one. I'll have that in the description and you can also see it on the screen now. So let's unpack a little bit about what resistance and damage reduction are, starting with resistance and vulnerability. I'm going to be talking about both of these, so yeah, the title is a little bit misleading because vulnerability is part of this as well. So let's talk about resistance first. There are three kinds or types of resistance. There's resistance X, where X is going to be some number, and that just reduces the damage you take of that damage type by X. So resistance 2 would reduce the damage of that type by 2. Resistance half is going to make you take only half of that damage. And remember that in DC20, half is rounded up. That's going to be very important in this video, so hold on to that. And resistance immune, where you take no damage of that type. On the other hand, we have vulnerability. There is vulnerability X, where you increase the damage of that type by X. Vulnerability double, where you double the damage, right, or take twice the damage of that type. There's no parallel to resistance immune for vulnerability. There's no such thing as like vulnerability everything. So there's just two kinds of vulnerability. Then we have DR, or damage reduction. And damage reduction comes in two forms. There's physical damage reduction, often called PDR, which is going to reduce the physical and elemental damage types, and mystical damage reduction, called MDR, which is going to reduce the mystical damage types you take. And so damage reduction has a value with it, so you might see something like 2 PDR. And what that means is when you're hit, that damage is reduced, right? So if I'm getting hit by a physical attack, I take some slashing damage, some fire damage, then the PDR is going to reduce that damage by 2 in the case of 2 PDR. And the interesting thing about damage reduction, which makes it a little bit more complicated or nuanced than resistance, is that damage reduction is bypassed on a heavy hit. So if a creature gets a heavy hit on you, your damage reduction doesn't apply. So let's start with the most basic math, and that's vulnerability X, right? Just vulnerability where we have some number. So I'm taking this example, this slide from my attack math video, where I'm looking at how we calculate damage, and I'm modifying it to talk about vulnerability. So you have some attack check A against a defense D, and you're using some weapon with some damage W. And in this case, you're doing it against an enemy with vulnerability X. And I'm using X here to talk about that since that's the number that's included in there. X is going to be that number, so that could be vulnerability 2, could be vulnerability 1, could be anything, right? So in this case, it's really simple and straightforward. All we do is we take that amount, right? If I have vulnerability 1, that would just be 1, and I add it to the weapon damage. So you'll see in this first term for a hit, I take my weapon damage, and I add on to that my vulnerability, the vulnerability that the enemy has, and that's going to give me the new damage formula. So it's quite a simple change. So let's talk about resistance X and why that's a little bit more nuanced. Resistance X is more or less the same thing. We're subtracting that amount X, right, that resistance from our base damage, but it's a little bit more complicated because sometimes, right, the resistance is going to be greater than the damage we deal, right? So imagine I have an enemy with resistance 5 to an attack, and I'm dealing 3 damage. It's obviously only going to reduce the damage to 3. I'm not dealing -2 damage or healing the creature. But if I get a heavy hit, right, and I deal 4 damage, well, that's still going to be reduced down to 0. So what we do is we take this kind of excess or spillover damage, and we're going to subtract that from the heavy, and if there's some more damage, right, we're going to subtract that from the brutal, and we kind of keep going on. So in the case of having resistance 5 and my base damage is 3, I would remove 3 from the weapon damage, and then I'd remove more of it from the heavy. I'd remove 1 more from heavy to kind of cancel that out. And then I'd remove 1 more from brutal, and I would kind of keep going down that. I'd keep removing the damage until the entire resistance has been used up, in a sense. So that's the extra nuance to resistance. If the resistance values are small, like resistance 1, it's typically just going to be as simple as subtracting it from the first number. It only gets a little bit more complicated if we're using or dealing with a really high number for resistance. Then we can talk about damage reduction. So damage reduction is kind of similar to resistance, where we're going to subtract whatever X is, right, the amount of DR that we have from the weapon damage. But because damage reduction has to do with these heavy hits, it's a little bit more straightforward almost in a way, where when you get a heavy hit, you're going to add that number back in. right? So for each time that you're getting a regular hit and a heavy hit, that kind of cancels out with each other, and you're kind of getting refunded that damage, right, that you would have missed out on. So that's how we're representing the fact that you're bypassing the damage resistance, or the damage reduction, sorry. Now, a neat kind of weird nuance here is that if the damage reduction value is greater than the base damage of your weapon, right? So if X in this case is greater than W, then we can just use W, right? The base damage of our weapon instead of X, right? The amount of damage reduction. Because if I am using a 1 base damage weapon and the damage reduction is 2, then I'm going to try to use my 1 base damage weapon. If I get a regular hit, it gets reduced down to 0, right? So I'm only reducing it by the amount that the weapon would be doing. And then if I get a heavy hit, then I'm just adding that extra damage back. I'm just doing 1 damage from my weapon, added back on. Okay. Then let's talk about where things start to get a little bit more complicated, which is the double and half. So let's start with double, because vulnerability is always a little bit easier than resistance. With vulnerability double, it's actually really straightforward. All we do is we just take the damage for each of these damages and we double it, right? So I take 2 times the weapon damage, I take 2 times the amount I'd be doing for a heavy hit. If you have impact, make sure to count that as well. So it's 2 times the regular amount for a heavy hit, which is 1, and 2 times impact. 2 times what you would get for a brutal, and 2 times what you would get for a crit, which is always 4, because critical hits always do 2 extra damage, right? And so vulnerability double is pretty straightforward. You take all those damage numbers and you just double them. The more complicated bit is resistance half, and let me show off why resistance half is a little bit more complicated. So what happens to damage with resistance half? I'm going to show you 2 scenarios. In the first one, we're going to assume I'm using a 3 base damage weapon. And in the second one, I'm going to talk about a 2 base damage weapon. So if I have a 3 base damage weapon and I hit, that's 3 damage normally, but it gets halved to 2 damage. Remember that in DC20, half is rounded up. So that 3 damage is halved to 1.5, and we round it up to 2 damage. If I get a heavy hit, that's going to be 4 damage, but then it gets halved to 2. If I get a brutal hit, that would be 5 damage, and it gets halved, and we round that up to 3. So what we can see here is that the hit and the heavy didn't change our damage at all. But when we got a brutal hit, we got an additional damage. And the crit is going to make it 7 damage, and that halved is 4, so we're still getting a little bit extra damage from a crit. If we compare that to the 2 base damage weapon, on a hit I deal 2 damage, which is halved to 1. On a heavy hit, I get 3 damage, which is halved to 2. On a brutal hit, I would get 4 damage, which is halved to 2 again, to 2 damage again. And on a crit, I would deal 6 damage, which is halved to 3 damage. So what's weird here? Well, what's weird is that odd and even base damage cause slightly different effects of getting a heavy hit, right? Or a brutal hit. Essentially, for odd base damage, the damage goes up on a brutal hit and basically every other kind of hit. So if I have a brutal hit, that means I'm succeeding by 10. It would also count on when I'm succeeding by 20 or 30, etc. But for an even base damage weapon, the damage goes up on a heavy hit and every other kind of hit. So it'd be a heavy hit, which is I'm succeeding by 5, and when I'm succeeding by 15, some people call that brutal +1, or when I'm succeeding by 25 or 35, etc. Right? The interesting part though is the crit is the same in both cases because we're adding 2 damage. That's always going to have the same impact on both of these. So this is why it's a little bit nuanced. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to talk about the way we can do the math for both an odd weapon and an even weapon as separate from each other. That way there's one equation for resistance half with an odd base damage weapon and resistance half with an even base damage weapon. So let's say I'm using resistance half for an odd damage weapon. Well, in this case, I'm going to take, this standard scenario, attack, check, defense, right, with some weapon damage, and I have resistance half. What we do is we half the base damage and we round that up, right? So that's just your regular half the damage. Then we're going to have 0 damage on a heavy hit. In fact, 0 times anything is going to be 0. So if you wanted to, you could just delete that section and not worry about the heavy hits at all. And then we're going to have +1 times the brutal hit, right? Because now brutal hits are increasing our damage again. So we're kind of just ignoring every other one, right? So in this case, heavy gets ignored, but brutal gets, factored in, and then brutal +1 would get ignored, but brutal +2 would get factored in if we hit really, really hard and that was possible. And for a crit, all we're going to do is just have it be +1 times, a 20th instead of having it be +2 times a 20th, right? We're still having the damage, that we would get from a crit, which would normally be 2, but we do still have some damage we're going to get from a crit in any situation. Then if we're using even damage, it's really similar to this, right? The first thing we do is we half the weapon damage, the base damage, but instead of before, right, if we compare it to the odd damage, here I'm going to have 0 for heavy and 1 for brutal. For an even base damage weapon, I'm going to do 1 additional damage on a heavy hit, but 0 additional damage on a brutal hit, right? And like I said before, we kind of have this every other alternating moment. Okay, and now we can get to the most complicated of all of them, resistance immune. Are you ready for it? Resistance immune is 0 damage. That's right. We finished off really with the most complicated one, which was resistance half. Resistance immune is trivially easy. Just forget that damage. You don't deal any of that damage. It's just 0. Super easy to deal with. So not really something worth really doing math here. Okay, and that's really everything I want to talk about with resistance, vulnerability, and damage reduction. So hopefully this helped you understand how you can factor these into these damage formulas if you wanted to add a little bit of extra detail. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and until the next time, have the best time.